Some countries in this world have what some might describe as quite unusual shapes. Some in particular are known for being long and skinny. One, for instance, being Vietnam, which, strangely, I don't think I've ever really talked about on this channel. So let's get into it. Why does Vietnam have its peculiar shape? This video is brought to you by private internet access. Doctors hate him. A local Southeast Asian socialist republic exposes the secret to keeping your borders effortlessly thin. To best understand Vietnam's geography, one might divide the country into three pieces: northern, central, and southern. If you're Vietnamese, you might know these regions as Bắc Bộ, Trung Bộ, and Nam Bộ. Do note I'm probably not going to get the tones right because, yeah, shocker, I don't exactly speak Vietnamese. Meanwhile, if you're more familiar with their old exonyms, you might have heard the names Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China, but I'm not going to use those names here. At its narrowest points in the center of the country, Vietnam's western border with Laos, yes it's pronounced Lao, is less than 50 kilometers from the world's most controversial sea. From Vinh to Da Nang, 400 kilometers of the country is confined to a corridor not even 100 kilometers wide at its widest point. So why... Oh god, that was too many whys. The answer as to why this is the case is rooted in Vietnam's tumultuous history. And geography, of course, but the history provides us with some good backstory for context. Now turn the clock back a couple thousand years, and Vietnam didn't look like this, but like this. And in fact, even calling it Vietnam would be a huge misnomer, as this country was called by many different names throughout its history. So I'll just call it by whatever kingdom ruled from this general area at whatever time I'm talking about. The first civilizations here, yes we're looking back that far, arose around the Red and Ma river valleys in the north of the modern country. Modern historians believe the first true non-mythical states arose here around 500 BC. But as fascinating as this all is though, we must now immediately fast back forward through history. A large part of this country's history though was falling under some form of imperial Chinese rule. First from the Han invasion of Nanya in 111 BC to the Chung Sisters Rebellion in AD 39, then from 4 years later until 541, and then a third time from 602 to 905, followed by a period of autonomy under Tang China until 938. Side note, Nanya was a Chinese term meaning Southern Ye, which in this area was pronounced more like Nam Viet, which would eventually become the country's name in 1804, except with the morpheme switched around at the request of the Qing Emperor. Anyway, at this point in history, this area formed a country known as Dai Viet, ruled by a succession of different dynasties. Dai Viet then fell under Chinese domination for the fourth time for a brief period from 1407 to 1428, when it was taken over by the Ming dynasty. In 1428, Lê Thái Tổ broke the country off from China and began the Lê dynasty, or more specifically the later Lê dynasty, as the Lê family had previously been in power centuries earlier. Dai Viet was still mostly centered around the traditional Vietnamese heartland in the north though, and it was largely in the 1470s when Lê Thái Tông conquered most of Champa to the south. At around this point, Dai Viet could be said to have adopted a new policy known by the term Nam Tien, literally a southward advance. Thus Tang Tong had now set his kingdom's diplomatic policies to expansionist. Severely oversimplifying everything because I'm just an American who only wants to know why the border all weird, Vietnam's gradual expansion south came as a result of a series of wars against their southern neighbors, the Kingdom of Champa. What would later become southern Vietnam was at this point known as Champa. A union of different polities, this area was inhabited by the Cham peoples, who are still around today by the way. Just thought I'd mention so no one got confused. The Cham had traditionally inhabited what is now central and southern Vietnam, establishing thriving trading relations with outside powers from powerhouse cities like Indrapura. Their language, Cham, is of the Austronesian family, closer to Malay, Indonesian, and Tagalog, whereas Vietnamese is classified as Austroasiatic. Anyone else think linguists could have maybe differentiated those names a bit more? As Vietnam sought to expand its influence and further its development, Vietnamese settlers began to move into lands conquered from Champa, settling new villages in the area. Vietnam's southward expansion, though, was significantly hemmed in by these mountains here, the Annamite Range. These mountains created a natural border between Vietnam and Laos, or I guess at this time, the kingdoms of Dai Viet and Lan Sang. However, some parts of Vietnam, namely the Central Highlands, fall on the western side of the range, though this likely has to do with the fact that the mountains are only tallest in the northwest in Laos. Somewhat interestingly though, The coast did once extend much further into modern-day water. With Ice Age sea levels around 50 meters lower, the coastline once extended more than 150 kilometers further than it does today, exposing now sunken lands like Nanhai Land until as relatively recently as 6 to 4000 BC. That doesn't really help Vietnam all that much today though, so back to the history. Aside from expanding his kingdom southward though, Lê Thanh Tông also led a campaign westward through the Annamite Range as far west as what is now eastern Myanmar in the Dai Viet Lan Sang War of 1479-84. This war turned out to be a complete failure for Dai Viet in terms of gaining territory, but it did allow them to largely destabilize their westerly neighbors and thus firmly secure their western borders. Okay, now that does explain why Vietnam has such a tiny narrow corridor, but Vietnam's southward expansion didn't end until it reached the very bottom of the peninsula, past the Mekong River Delta, which at this point was still part of Cambodia, or Kampuchea. In the 15th century, the Lê dynasty was briefly ousted by the Mac dynasty. However, just a few years later, the Lê were able to come back to power, but didn't quite get the whole country back together, with the Mac still in power north of the Red River. Later on, the Nguyen clan were able to carve out a foothold in the south, rivaling the Lê, who were now essentially puppets of the Cheng and Nguyen clans, who had previously helped them defeat the Mac. The Cheng-Nguyen Civil War in the 17th century in particular caused Viet refugees to seek refuge wherever possible. Cambodian King Che Cheta II allowed them refuge in the city of Pret Nacor in 1623 in exchange for aid against Siam. Gradually, more and more Vietnamese moved into the city, causing it to slowly become more and more Vietnamized. It was further into the 18th century, however, when various Nguyen lords sought to expand even further south and conquer the Mekong Delta for themselves, including Pret Nacor, or as it was known in Vietnamese, Saigon. Hemmed in by mountains to the west and seas to the east, and having spent much of its early history under Chinese influence, the kingdoms which would evolve into modern Vietnam saw a need to expand in order to develop further. And the only way to do so realistically was straight south in this narrow corridor. One unfortunate side of all this history, though, were periods of genocide between different groups, namely against the Chams in the 15th century and later massacres against Vietnamese and Cambodians within each other's empires. I'm not going to elaborate too much on this since these videos are very tedious for me to make and I would still like to be paid for my work, but it would have been incredibly disingenuous to talk about this history without at least mentioning this. Real quick, I want to credit the work of Ben Kiernan, particularly his book covering the history of Vietnam, as well as the PR team on the KhAnubis Discord server for helping me research this and hopefully not get things incredibly wrong. We're finally entering orbit. We should be down on Arcadia within the next 2 hours. Ah, great. Cool. We're going to need to keep our tracks hidden as best we can. Plus, the internet in Arcadia is heavily restricted. Well, what do you suggest? I think we ought to install a VPN. A VPN? What does that stand for? Well, a lot of important issues, I'm sure, but it's also an abbreviation which stands for Virtual Private Network. Personally, I've been using Private Internet Access. Private Internet Access can protect you and your devices from trackers and malicious websites, and it can be used on Windows, macOS, Linux, iOS, Android, and so many more. Wait, we're still using the same operating systems in the 24th century? Plus, you can use it on up to 10 devices with the same account. Definitely enough to run a spaceship. Private Internet Access has over 75 customers with servers in more than 30 million countries. Wait, hang on, I think it's the other way around. Besides, Arcadia and Netflix doesn't even have bitchin' fishing. They don't have bitchin' fishing? They don't have bitchin' fishing. Okay, I'm definitely sold now. How do I get it? Well, by going to the link at the top of the description, you can get yourself a 3-year plan for $198 a month. That's an 83% discount, plus they're offering 4 extra months for free. And if you just want to try it out, they also offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. Wow, an 83% discount on a 3-year plan, plus another 4 months, all on a 30-day guarantee, on what has arguably become an important service in our day-to-day lives? I think I will go check out Private Internet Access via the link at the top of the description. Okay, you don't have to be entirely cheesy about it.